It's a great pleasure to be here. I grew up in India where I studied engineering as an undergraduate. I then went to the United States and studied business. And I've taught both in the US and in Europe. I've been in Cambridge for some years now. Throughout my career, I've studied innovation. And the first part of my career, I studied innovation as it was done in large Western corporations, because that was the understanding about where innovation was done. But more recently, I've turned my attention to looking at innovation in emerging economies like India. And when I started doing that, I was quite surprised by what I found. I found that Indian innovators were different from their Western counterparts in at least three ways. First, they were very frugal. They were very good at taking cost out of the entire innovation process and making do with limited resources. Perhaps this was because they faced resource constraints in their environment. Second, the mindset was very frugal, very flexible. They were good at improvising. They might have a plan, but they were good at switching from one plan to the next. And this is because perhaps their environment is very unpredictable and constantly changing. And third, a lot of their solutions seemed designed to bring people from outside the formal economy into the formal economy. And perhaps this is because there are lots of people who are outside the formal economy, and they offer an opportunity to these innovators. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Now, this is a bit of a caricature, but in the West, we may be familiar with innovations like this. This is a very high-end fridge, which will talk to you and will talk back to you through the medium of a tablet PC. And for that, you pay about $3,000. It's a rather expensive way to store your caviar. In the Indian context, you're more likely to see something like this. This is at most a $30 fridge. It's made entirely of clay and uses the cooling properties of water evaporating through the walls of that box to keep fruit and vegetables fresh for up to 5 days. Now, this is very frugal because it uses widely available resources like clay and water. The person who came up with this was from a village in Gujarat in India. Very flexible, very good at improvising solutions and dealing with unexpected events. And he's gone on to do other things, not only improve this fridge, but also to make clay water filters and make non-stick frying pans made of clay and so forth. And finally, it's inclusive because his objective was to make a fridge that people like him could afford. And in many cases around the world, people typically would like a fridge but can't afford one. But even if they can afford one, they may not have access to electricity, and this, of course, avoids that problem. Here's another example. Now, this is a very high-end incubator. It's about $20,000 from a company like GE. It's a beautiful machine. Very few infants who have access to this will ever die because they'll be supported by this. But $20,000 makes it very hard and inaccessible to people living in remote parts of Africa or Asia. In situations like that, something like this might be more powerful. This is less than $200, so 1/100th the cost of the incubator. And it's not really an incubator, of course, so it's important to point out. It's a baby warmer, but it deals with 80% of the problem that millions of infants around the world face, problem of infant mortality. When infants are born even 2 weeks prematurely, they can't maintain their body temperature, and this blanket helps them to do that. Also, the mother can actually hold the baby, and you see that it has a pad, it has a waxy phase change material in that pad, which helps to maintain temperature at a fixed degree. And this can be done by heating it, either using electricity or water. And in fact, this came out of some students at Stanford. They have tested this with mothers and midwives in Nepal and in India, and it's now selling in many Indian states through the government health system. So my co-authors and I came across many such examples, not only in India but elsewhere. And in India, when we asked people how they would describe this frugal, flexible, inclusive approach, they would use this Hindi word, jugaad. So we used this term in the book that we wrote, and we called it Jugaad Innovation, where we defined jugaad as the art of overcoming harsh constraints by improvising an effective solution using limited resources. And the emphasis is on a good enough solution. It may not be a perfect solution, but it's good enough to solve the problem. And when we were researching the book and blogging about it, a lot of people from other parts of the world wrote to us to say, hey, we have an equivalent in our country too. The Brazilians told us they had two different terms to describe this. And we discovered that even in more developed economies, there were equivalents. And I think the Maker Faire is an example of that kind of thing in the West. Now, let me say a bit about Jugaad in the West, because since the book came out about 2 years ago, the book was very much about emerging economies, developing countries. But since it came out, I've been struck by how much of this is going on in developed economies. Partly this is because, I think, of resource constraints even in the West, particularly post-financial crisis. But I think it's also driven by positive drivers in the West. People have access to tools and technologies now that enable them, even in small teams with limited budgets, to do amazing things. And the Maker Faire is full of such examples. Let me give you a few. This is a group called Design for America. They came out of Northwestern University in Chicago, 4 of them, with a background in design, business, and engineering. And they said, to solve problems, you don't need to go to Africa and Asia. There are plenty in the US, such as, for instance, hospital-acquired infections, which result in something like 100,000 deaths every year in the US alone. So what did they do? They went to neighboring hospitals in Chicago. They talked to doctors and nurses. They observed them. And they realized very quickly that doctors and nurses have every intention of being hygienic, but there are many moments when they cannot go to a wall unit to wash their hands or to use some gel. So they went back to their studio, and using basic computing equipment, software, and a 3D printer, they came up with a prototype which you see over there. It's called SwipeSense. Basically, the idea was, let's take that wall unit and have it clip onto the doctors' and nurses' scrubs so they can wash their hands even between micro operations on the fly. It also has a sensor which sends a signal every time they use it to a wall unit that records the data, and in the evening, the doctor or nurse can upload that data and visualize how their behavior was during the day. And they can also compare their performance to others like them in the hospital. Now, this is all done by a small group of students. All the elements of the marketing, of innovation are in there. They got the idea, they developed it, and they're even marketing it without having large budgets. For instance, they don't have an advertising budget. They've just used viral and social media to get the word out. Here's an example from Cambridge where I teach, a former student of mine, Eben Upton, who came up with a Raspberry Pi, which is a slightly bigger version of the Arduino that you see around here in the Maker Faire. And his idea was, he was selecting students to study computer science in Cambridge, and he noticed that these students were very bright, but they never looked inside a computer and played with the hardware, and they were not very familiar with coding. So he said, what if we can produce a computer that's so cheap, you can give one to every school kid in the UK, and they can play with it, and even if it breaks, there's no problem because it's so cheap. And that's how the Raspberry Pi came out. And that's the Pi he's holding in his hand, which has a number of portals, and you can connect your own visual display, all kinds of memory devices, and so forth. Now, the interesting thing is this was intended for school kids, but I think it's more their dads and their parents who are now using it to develop all kinds of applications, from weather reporting to agriculture and so forth. Now, we all carry around very powerful computers in our pockets these days, in smartphones. And people have been leveraging that widely available technology to develop other innovations, such as CellScope. This is a group from the University of California at Berkeley who have come up with a device that fits into the audio jack of a smartphone and which can be used as an otoscope to look inside the human ear, as the mother is doing with her daughter. If your daughter has a ear infection, you can look in, take photographs, and send them to a doctor, a specialist who may be somewhere else. So telemedicine using widely available technologies such as the smartphone. And of course, this has resulted in this huge movement that we see here, for instance, today, of makers, people like you and me, ordinary people who in their homes are developing new things and then come to a place like this to share and talk about them. And it's not just adults, increasingly it's children, and I think that's the wonderful part of this. It's multi-generation, and it's a grassroots movement that we're seeing in the West. For instance, if you have an idea or your child has an idea, they can do a diagram or drawing, even a 2D drawing, and then send it to someone else like Shapeways, a company that will actually 3D print it for you. So you don't even have to have 3D printers. And they will print out an idea which may be a toy, but increasingly there are more sophisticated things that are being printed out, such as dentists sending photographs of teeth and getting teeth printed out, and so forth. So the possibilities are quite amazing. And there are spaces where people can go to tinker. There are fab labs and tech shops, which are equipped with all kinds of tools, both traditional tools, but also more contemporary tools like CNC cutters, 3D printers, and so forth. So you can tinker, and you can share your ideas with others, and you can come up with your prototypes, which somebody can manufacture, and then you can sell. An example of something that came out of a tech shop is this little white square that you see, called the Square, which was prototyped in a tech shop. And the idea was this will fit into the audio jack of a smartphone and can be used as a credit card reader. So if you have an idea, you can actually go to a tech shop and come up with a prototype and then eventually manufacture and sell it. We've talked a lot about healthcare and so on, but another big deficit in the world is finance. A lot of people are unbanked. And these people are not only in developing countries, but also in the West. There are a lot of people who live entirely in the cash economy. They don't have bank accounts, and bank accounts actually are not frugal enough for them. So, but these people have access to the web. So for instance, in the US, people might be able to go online to buy a Greyhound bus ticket. But if they don't have credit cards, how would they be able to pay? So Pay Near Me is a company that's come up to help people in the cash economy to buy off the internet. So you can buy your ticket on the internet, and then it'll text you a message to your phone, and you can go to a neighboring shop, a corner shop, a 7-Eleven, show them the email, they scan it, you pay in cash, and you get your ticket. So this is one way to include people who are outside the banking system. And we see equivalents of this in Europe. This is an example from France, where this gentleman has come up with the financial equivalent of the Logan, the car that Renault introduced, a value for money car that they initially got the idea for from Eastern Europe, but which is now selling very well in Western Europe. He wanted to come up with the equivalent in banking, a bank that would be affordable and meaningful to people, and that's what he's come up with, Compnickel, which basically for 25 euros a year, that's the only fee you pay, you get more or less branchless banking, which takes advantage of the fact that people have phones, and a lot of it is mobile-based. But instead of going to a bank branch, you can go to a neighboring shop, your corner shop, and that acts, your tabak, and that acts as the bank branch for you. Now, large firms have been very interested in getting into this. Traditionally, they have done R&D in big labs, but now they're finding that that's not frugal enough, and they want to tap into this frugal revolution that's happening around them. So this is Ford, the car company, that has partnered with Tech Shop to create a tech shop for Ford employees, where Ford employees can go in their spare time and tinker, not only with other Ford employees, but with people like you and me. And not only do the employees enjoy this, but they've also become more productive, and Ford has found that its patenting capacity has gone up without any additional spending. Another company that's getting into this is GE. And here we see Beth Comstock, who is the Chief Marketing Officer of General Electric, with the guy in the middle, who's Ben Kaufman, a very young CEO of a company called Quirky. Quirky is a startup in New York that crowdsources ideas for innovations. So people like you and me will make suggestions, and then others like us will vote on those suggestions, and a few are selected by Quirky. They will develop them in their lab, and then will manufacture and even sell them on your behalf, and you get a part of the revenues. A few months before GE got together with Quirky, someone like you and me, a guy called Garth and Leslie, who's an independent innovator and inventor, got the idea for a smartphone-enabled air conditioner. Garthan used to live in Washington, and he would travel to work every day in his car, and in summer he would see that lots of people in apartment buildings would leave their air conditioning on during the day while they were at work to make sure the apartment was cool when they came home. And he thought this was very wasteful, but what if they could control it with their smartphone? So that was his idea, which he submitted to Quirky. And it so happened that GE at the same time had asked Quirky to help them to revitalize their air conditioning line. So now GE and Quirky have come up with this smartphone-enabled air conditioning unit, and Garth and Leslie has got a share of the revenues. Let me end with a few words and thoughts on Jugaad in Italy. Italy has a great tradition of art and design and of family business, and so you would think that this is very much in keeping with the Italian way. Here are some examples that I've encountered myself. For instance, the artist Bruno Munari in the 50s came up with a kind of a cheap alternative to sunglasses using just cardboard. And this was something that the American president, Dwight Eisenhower, used when he was on the campaign trail in the US in the 50s. And basically, the idea of applying these constructivist principles using everyday materials like wire and paper, I think exemplified in the microscope we'll be seeing in a little while, can be of inspiration to people even in the 20th century. Vittorio Levi is someone I've encountered here in Italy who has this company called Fiam Italia that makes objects from glass. Now, often there's a lot of waste after they've made certain objects when they manufacture glass objects, and typically they would throw away the waste. But now they've found ways not only to recycle, but to upcycle this waste glass by putting in design and aesthetics. So they create these objects, beautiful objects from waste glass, and that actually increases their value. I think that's another interesting aspect of frugal innovation. And of course, you have Massimo Banzi and the Arduino, which you see in evidence here at the Maker Faire. A very powerful way to take frugality from electronics and bring it, and computing, and bring it to the maker movement. So my conclusions are as follows. I think this kind of frugal, flexible, inclusive approach to innovation is not only something you see in developing countries, it's a global phenomenon. You see equivalents here in the West. I think Italy and Italians have a natural inclination for this kind of thing. They have this tradition of design and art and family business, and I think they can excel at this in the 21st century. And I think particularly the youth are key. It's wonderful to see so many young people here today participating in this process. I think young people in Italy can take that tradition, marry it to things like 3D printing and the Arduino, and become Leonardos of the future. On that note, thank you very much.